There was a middle-aged bachelor that found himself in love with a beautiful woman. Well, one night after a very enjoyable date, they were driving along, and on impulse, he turned to her and he asked, "Will you marry me?" Well, the woman replied, "Oh, yes, yes." But then there was this long, awkward silence that followed. And so she said, "Don't you have anything else to say?" He cleared his throat, and then he said, "I think I've said too much already." Isn't that something about love? It seems pretty impulsive. It's up and it's down. It's hot and it's cold. Well, as a pastor, you can imagine, I do an awful lot of marriage counseling, and a question that I'll often ask is, what is it that you think draws a man and a woman together to be married? And the common answer is love. But what is love? Is love something you fall into and then you fall out of it? Is love just chemicals that fire in our brain and throughout our bodies? Is love a feeling? Is it emotions? Or is it something more? Over the years, people have told me that they want to be married because they love each other. I've also had people tell me they don't want to be married because they no longer feel love for their spouse. And because of that, we need to ask some questions. As I've been contemplating what love truly is, I recently read an article written by a friend of mine named Pastor Steve Cornell, who is the pastor of Millerville Bible Church up in north of Lancaster. I want to share with you some of his thoughts on what love is. I really appreciate what he says. Pastor Cornell says that he's concluded that we need to distinguish between two distinct dimensions of love. He says, first, there's being in love, but second, there's the dimension of behaving in love. Now let me explain what each of those are. You see, being in love, that's the dimension that is more of an emotional attraction. It's what people mean when they speak of falling in love. It's usually based on more of our superficial reactions to attraction and to impressions. There's nothing wrong with being in love or this emotional component. It's just not enough to truly sustain a meaningful and lasting relationship. It's just way too superficial. Because a deeply satisfying relationship has to be built on this second dimension of love, and that is the dimension of behaving in love. Now, this dimension is not dependent on feelings, it's not dependent on chemistry, it is a choice. It's an action of the will. It's when we choose to respond to our spouse in a loving manner, regardless of how we feel. Now, this dimension of love is a choice we make to value our spouse and to seek his or her best interest. Now, I can't always make myself feel a certain way. You can't command your feelings. But we can always choose to act in a loving way. It's a choice to act in love when we don't feel like love. Now, I realize as I speak this that you almost think I'm crazy. Well, are you kidding me? Because the culture that we live in teaches us that our feelings are what matter most. That you have to be true to your feelings, and that if you don't feel love, well, you're being dishonest with someone to say you love them. But that's not at all what the Bible teaches, and it's what God describes as love is. And so, how often do you not feel like going to work? I bet that's more times than you might like to admit. But you still do it. Why? Because you realize that your feelings aren't the end all. You have to make a living. There's things that you have to do. And so you make a choice to master your feelings of not wanting to go to work. Oftentimes, we might feel great anger. We feel like punching somebody in the nose. But we realize we're not going to do that because we just might get arrested for assault. And so we master those feelings. But there's something strange when it comes to this idea of love, in that we think that our feelings need to master us. But that's not what the Bible teaches. In fact, the Bible says that we're to have the same type of love for each other that Jesus has for us. You know, in Romans 5:8 we read, God demonstrated his own love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You see, Jesus didn't come and die on that cross because we're cute, lovable, fuzzy, warm people. It was a choice, an act of his will, that he would love us. And he gave himself in that way for our best interest and valued us in the process. In Ephesians 5 and verse 25, Paul tells us that is the very same kind of love that we are to have for our wives, towards each other. You know, folks, I think it'd be good that we spend a lot of time reflecting on these two dimensions of love. On being in love, and then secondly, on behaving in love.